that still not used to. Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to this early September. All of you, I think, are back in school, back to school webinar that Thinking Nation and the Center for Civic Education banded together to host. And just a little bit of context for historical thinking, preference, I guess. Donna and I often have come together and talked about the way in which the education field is moving and the way in which it should be moving, and they are not always aligned. And so we thought it would be helpful to have this mindset-oriented webinar, really hopefully as an encouragement to all of you who are in the classrooms doing the work, navigating an incredibly polarizing political climate with all sorts of things that are changing every day. And so we hope that this can serve as a way to reflect and be encouraged in all the great work that you are doing. So with that, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Zach Coté, and I serve as the Executive Director for Thinking Nation. Our nonprofit organization focuses really on equipping and empowering students through historical thinking, and we'll talk a lot about that today and why that empowerment is so helpful. And we serve schools in a number of ways. We run professional learning series and professional development for schools. We have an online platform that gives teachers the tools to teach and, I would argue, most importantly, assess historical thinking and provide that measurement for some success that defines our discipline. And we get somewhat fancy in using AI to produce data reports and grading for teachers. And we also write comprehensive courses for schools and districts in various regions throughout the country. I love every aspect of my job. It's incredibly exciting to be, at the intersection of civics and history. And then personally, my wife and I have 3 girls. One just turned 6 last week. One turns 9 in 2 weeks. And then our little 2.5-year-old is the one non-Virgo birthday in our house. So she has a few more months to go. But that's a little bit about me, and I'll hand it over to Donna to introduce herself.
Thanks, Zach. And thank you for inviting me and the center to participate in this webinar. I feel like we've been talking about it for a while, and this is a really exciting opportunity. And also, the back to school timing, I think, is a unique way to position this conversation tonight too. So I'm the president and CEO at the Center for Civic Education. We have 2 flagship programs. I'll talk a little bit more about them in case you're not familiar. We the People and Project Citizen. And we have been around since, excuse me, 1965. And our flagship program, We the People, was started at the bicentennial in 1987. And it is a fully immersive curriculum aligned to social studies, government, and history standards. Upper elementary, middle school, and high school. Project Citizen is community engagement for public policy. And I'll touch on those a little bit more in context of what we're discussing tonight. And just on a personal note, I have 2 sophomores, one sophomore in high school and one sophomore in college. And I know you all can't believe that I am old enough to have 2 sophomores. I think they just landed on my doorstep without my knowing, and and here they are. So back to school is in full swing in our household. I'll turn it back to Zach.
Thanks, Donna. And yes, given the Center for Civic Education's long-standing history and leadership in the civic space, the center and Donna specifically are such mentors for us as such a young organization. So we're grateful to be here together. And that's a good kind of segue just to say thank you. Thank you all for being here on a Thursday afternoon or evening, depending on what part of the country you're at. As I said at the beginning, we really hope that this is a place for encouragement and inspiration. You have a lot of tools, that are accessible for you. And the way in which we think about those tools can really drastically shift their success. And so we hope that this is a way that challenges everyone's thinking. But thank you so much for being here. Just a quick agenda. If you saw our flyer, this is really just that. We want to talk about inquiry as this foundation for everything else. I want to make a link between historical thinking as a disposition and a discipline to these dispositions that are essential for citizens to have to maintain a democracy. And then Donna will connect this mindset shift to ways that we can seize constitutional moments in our classrooms. And then we'll have a little bit of time for reflection and, if you're open, discussion. So just a quick kind of preview or review of Thinking Nation as an organization. We have really compartmentalized our mission as an organization into these three categories that I think are worth naming. And so I'll contextually talk about them, but first and foremost, students must be empowered if we are going to be a successful nation, a thinking nation. And we think that the way in which students think is one of the greatest assets towards empowerment. And so that's kind of at the heart of what we do. However, a lot of our materials and resources are teacher facing. And so we, in order to exercise that mission, we want to support teachers. We want to make sure that the curriculum you use, the training you get, and the technology that you have your hands on are meaningful for empowering students. We think that those two things can leverage this transformation of social studies education that I'm going to argue needs to be transformed if we care about the future of our democracy. And so these three things, it's to empower, to support, and transform, link through each other, on top of each other, integrate in a way that we hope can really just equip students to build a better future.
I put a lot of words on this slide. And like I said, I'll touch a little bit more on our flagship programs for those who aren't familiar, but our mission since 1965 has been to promote an enlightened and responsible citizenry committed to the democratic principles and actively engaged in the practice of democracy. So the principles and the practice of democracy taken hand in hand. It's not one or the other, it's a both and. And that approach permeates our flagship programs as well as our approach to professional learning, all of our free resources, our mentorship that we have to support our programs. And so you'll learn more about it. But if you haven't heard of We the People or Project Citizen, that was a quick hit.
Thanks, Donna. So let's set some context. I pose this question a bit rhetorically. Just want to, come clean on that. But I ask often in different spaces, do education stakeholders take us seriously? And so, and I'll give a quick example. A lot of schools around the country subscribe to Thinking Nation's platform, right? This is it's a paid platform per student. And very often we'll hear from departments, oh yeah, we don't have a drop in our budget for history education. We'll probe a little bit and understand about the budget for other subjects. And not only do they exist, but they are well padded. And so we live in this very interesting space where people say we're important and then, don't show that in their actions or in the power of the purse or in the way that they allocate time, et cetera. And so back in November, so almost 2 years ago, 2023, we partnered with EdWeek to release this white paper on the state of social studies education. And so I wanted to draw attention to a few data points from this white paper that I think realize that the answer to that question. So first, this was a nationally representative survey of school leaders, of teachers, not just in social studies, but in all subjects. And 98% of the respondents said that education must prepare students for civic society. Now, I think I hope that all of us can hear that and then also be humble enough to say we have failed. Education has not prepared students for civic society. And I think that the correlation is more than correlation. Only 8% of those respondents said that social studies is a top priority. I was meeting with the director of the Reagan Library recently, and we were talking about how that 8% is probably inflated because people like to think that it's a top priority and they say it, but in reality, that's probably not true. So the stark contrast here of what we say education should do and how we allocate funds and time are something to talk about. And of course, social studies is not the only venue to prepare students for civic society, but unlike other subjects, no one doubts that it is a venue. And so we also have to acknowledge that. Another thing that we saw, and I have anecdotes for this, less than a quarter of the teachers said that their PD for social studies was very sufficient or excellent. I've had many teachers reach out to me, said, I found out about Thinking Nation by Googling while at a professional development because their professional development wasn't meeting their classroom needs. This is problematic if we care about a paradigm shift and we care about our democracy. Now, this is something that I hope we can be self-reflective on our departments and so forth. So not only do only about 40% of teachers use inquiry-based instruction at least once a week, we have less than 10% that use it daily, or right at 10% that use it daily, excuse me. And then, combine that with never, we have almost 20% of people who maybe never use it and or like don't use it all the time. And as I'm going to talk about, if we teach a discipline, this is unacceptable. If we are equipping students to remember information, this is fine, right? But if we're equipping students in a discipline with dispositions, inquiry must be the driving foundation of everything that we do. And then lastly, oh, good, never mind, that was my last piece. So with this context, with this, kind of lip service to civic education and history, lack of resources, and a lack of execution, that leads me to like kind of what I just said, that this is kind of our mantra. If you've ever heard me talk in any space before, you've probably seen this slide, that history is a discipline and not a content. And we'll talk about the nuances there in a minute, but we have this quote here from historian Lynn Hunt: history does not stand still, even if most monuments do. Another historian that I've been influenced by, John Fia, said, the past never changes, but history changes all the time. And that's because of its disciplinary nature, right? So the content is what we use to teach this discipline. That's why it has a degree, right? We don't give people degrees for memory. But we give them degrees for engagement and wrestling and analysis, and that makes it disciplinary. And disciplinary work is dispositional work, which we're going to talk about. So some of these things are kind of mindset shifts that we want to really think through as we're getting into the school year, getting into all the things we can't control as the school year begins. So in this discipline, questions drive everything, right? Those of you who went to school for history or for a social studies related discipline know that most of your degree was defined by your ability to ask and then answer a question, right? Research. And so those of you familiar with the C3 framework are probably aware of this inquiry arc, but I just want to acknowledge a few things. That first, inquiry begins with a question, right? We need to create inquisitive and curious students. Next, it demands sources. As I used to tell my students, your opinions don't matter in my class. And they would groan, and then I would pause and remind them, unless you have evidence, right? It demands sources. If we don't have the sources to back up our answers, then we can't really engage in this inquiry-based practice. And then in the classroom, it ends with this summative task that involves both making and supporting arguments. And so this is a really kind of cookie cutter but helpful structure for thinking about inquiry-based practice. And so this is something that was published here in 2017. The C3 framework is still alive and well. Some of us get into far too intellectual debates about it, but nonetheless, this is something that we're striving to define classrooms by. I also want to acknowledge that this isn't new. A lot of times when I've been in marketing meetings, people tell me, Zach, you need to use words like you're innovative, you're all these ed tech catchphrases. And my argument is always, but we're not. We're calling ourselves to something that is really timeless and supported by decades and hundreds of years of inquiry. And so as nerds do, was reading an old American Historical Association report, this one from 1898, published in 1899, and I came across this line. I genuinely still don't know how like it just ended this way, but I've come to live by it. And so I want to take a sentence to read it. The authors wrote that the chief object of every experienced teacher is to get pupils to think properly after the method adopted in his particular line of work. Not an accumulation of information, but the habit of correct thinking is the supreme result of good teaching in every branch of instruction. We're going to focus on social studies, but this is true everywhere, right? It's correct thinking that guides us. And correct thinking, if we want to have a debate on what correct thinking is, we can, that's fine. But I think it's safe to say that there are some, this is good and this is bad approaches to history or to thinking. And so acknowledging this timeless, this is 125 years old that this was published, that this is a disposition of the discipline that we teach. I was reading an old book, I think it's from 1970, called Historians' Fallacies. Many of you maybe have read it, by David Hackett Fisher. And he has this line in the conclusion. And he basically says, there is no historical fact that everyone needs to know. And that's a bold statement because a lot of people would say, oh, but they have to know blank, right? And he kind of challenged that. He says, but there's no single fact that everyone needs to know. And so what do we do with that? And we really focus on what empowers students. And it's these habits, it's these dispositions, it's this disciplinary mindset. So a practical thing that I like to acknowledge, because based on everything I just said, a lot of people will kind of claim that I don't care about content, that it's like a skills versus content debate, and I am 100% on the skills side. And I as a historian, I would say it's way more complex than that. It's more nuanced. And so I want to acknowledge one thing, that history is not the past, it's the study of the past, which means that we use historical content as a means to an end to engage in that thinking. You can't study history without the past. Content is essential. As someone who likes to talk, I think lectures are essential. I think it's important to be a disseminator of information. The question is to what ends, right? And we want to empower our students to think. So we want to lean into historical thinking using content as both the catalyst and conduit towards that. And so hopefully these things kind of frame our minds. Now, one thing that many of you may kind of be where you might be at here is, yes, I know these things to be true, but executing them is difficult, right? Students struggle with this work. Time doesn't always allow for deep engagement in historical thinking. And so these are some of the factors that I hope that we can process and think through. But we really want this to be our foundation as teachers, this process of inquiry and historical thinking. And so that becomes the lens in which we see what we do. So why spend this time on historical thinking? I'll do a quick shameless plug. The National Association for State Boards of Education released their quarterly journal yesterday. And so NASB is the short, and this is where all state boards of education kind of come for their information. And so for this one, it was on civic ready students. And one thing that I talked about in the report or in the journal was the direct link between historical thinking and civic dispositions. I say this because sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the necessary or the tools that students need to be successful in civic society, right? But I'm just teaching ancient civilizations. Oh, if I was teaching American government, or if I was teaching US history, I could do this better. I could prepare my students better. But I hope that we see that all the courses that we teach give us an opportunity to equip our students with the ability to think. And that really can cultivate these civic dispositions that Donna and I have become so fascinated by. And so in the civic education conversation, there's generally these two camps, that civic education is an accumulation of civic knowledge. So we see this with a lot of state legislation that's been passed. Students are required to pass the citizenship exam or some sort of other metric for civic knowledge. And then sometimes when we talk about civic dispositions, we'll maybe lean more. So what I mentioned is probably more right of center, more left of center on the political spectrum would probably talk more about civic activism. What does it look like to be actively engaged as a citizen? And dispositions, they take a little bit of both, right? And there's an overlap for sure with civic knowledge, but it's civic knowledge with an aim, not just an accumulation, but a usability of that knowledge. And dispositions are how we orient ourselves to those of us, those in our lives or around us. And so just like we utilize historical content in our classrooms to empower our students to think historically, I hope that we utilize civic knowledge in order to cultivate these dispositions that are in our students. So one thing that just to call out, once again, if we're using the ancient civilizations example here, history is the study of the past. And I would say that the chief aim of the historian is twofold. One is to portray as accurate picture of the past as possible, knowing that we can never get pure accurate, like true perfect accuracy, but as close as possible. And then second is to understand people from a time and place not like our own. And when we do that in our study of the past, we're better equipped to do that in our present, right? So historical thinking has made me a better reader, writer, analyst, or whatever. But honestly, a better dad, a better husband, a better neighbor, a better son, and so forth, because historical thinking has equipped me to orient myself towards this more humble approach of understanding people rather than proving a point. And so when we do this, this is where we get to really equip students with this sense of curiosity, but also a sense of empathy, which I think leads to this intellectual humility that is really important and I would argue missing in our public spaces where we want to show people why we're right rather than understand why people think differently than us. And if my job as a historian is to understand people and to practice that historical empathy, I'm equipped to do that in my own life. And so some things to consider is that when we do these things, and we'll look at some practical examples here in a minute, one, I think the culture wars are defined by the content we teach. Historical thinking, if that becomes our foundation, allows us to rise above. If historical thinkers are naturally curious, they're naturally empathetic. We're also humble enough to say that our opinions don't matter unless we have evidence. So we're better equipped at using evidence in our reasoning. And we're not going to, have rash conclusions. We're good at contextualizing, trying to understand what led to something. Why are my neighbors the way they are? And we leave room for complexity. If history is just content narratives, complexity gets in the way of a good story. But historical thinkers recognize that nothing's binary and that we this current society. Let's talk about some practical measures. As I collect myself, so I can leave this here. If you're looking for tools, based on some of the things we're going to talk about, you don't have access to some of Thinking Nation's protocols, resources, classroom posters, sample assignments, feel free to scan this, sign up, and we'll send you a bunch of stuff that you can put into practice based on some of the practical questions I want us to consider. And I can always put the link to that in the chat in a little bit. So in your classrooms, once again, I want to kind of acknowledge that a lot of us here probably acknowledge that a lot of the things that I said are true, and it's what we care about and believe in. The issue that I think we can have is that we know these things to be true, but our students don't have that language. And so one of these kind of guiding things for me in both the resources we create and the classrooms I serve is to make the implicit explicit. So anytime I recognize something to be important, I need to name it for my students. I need to create visuals for it. I need to create practices around it. And so this is why for our historical thinking skills throughout our curriculum, we've embedded these through everything. So you'll see them in the resources. Those of you who use our platform or curriculum, you'll see them everywhere, that every time students are engaging in some sort of analysis that is linked to, say, historical significance, this icon is here, right? In every graphic organizer that you're going to see maybe causation or historical empathy next to a question that you're answering. And the idea is that every time students engage in work, you're not just being explicit about what you are teaching, you are being explicit about how students are engaging with that what. And this is really critical. I talk a lot about creating cognitive apprentices, thinking aloud, naming what you're doing, pushing the what or pushing the how above the what. So that way students know the processes that they're engaging with that can help push things forward. And so another kind of like practical thing, I think I put these in the email if you scan the QR code, is to be explicit on what's on your wall. So this is a good example. You can put these posters on your walls. I think they print as 18 by 24s. But also, what kind of student work are you showing on your wall, right? If I'm just showing students' content retention or artistic creativity, but I'm not showing their thinking processes and the work that I'm putting on my wall, I'm sending a message to my students that I care about their ability to retain information, but not to engage with information. And so how we make things explicit in our class goes a long way. Sam Weinberg says that historical thinking is an unnatural act. So let's be honest, it's unnatural, right? So the more explicit we can be, the more natural that it can become. And that can feel overwhelming, I think, when we're trying to make the implicit explicit. It's like, oh, shoot, I didn't name this. And so I think an important thing to recognize is that if we want to shift this paradigm from history as a content to history as a discipline, we actually don't have to throw out everything that we do. When Copernicus told the world that everything revolved around the sun rather than the earth, nothing about our solar system changed. The way in which the solar system operated since time immemorial never changed, but the way in which the world saw the solar system changed. A lot of things in our classes we don't have to change, but the way in which we see them, the way in which we call them out must change. And so for our platform, we provide these like entry points, right? So it's like, how do I analyze effectively? What protocols do I use? How do I assess progress in historical thinking? How do I assess in benchmark formats with historical thinking? And you can see, we're not going to go over all these things, but you see like once a week, twice a month, a couple times a year. And the idea is by changing how we see things rather than everything that we do, these entry points bring things to life. They bring that discipline to the forefront of what students do. And so I want to close out with some questions and some considerations. And so when we're thinking about this disciplinary mindset, we have to ask, like, how is class time spent? Is it spent covering material or giving students time to uncover material? What protocols are in place? Do students see analysis, source analysis, or historical thinking as an added burden to what they're doing? Or is that just like par for the course? This is what we do in my class. So what protocols do I have? Am I measuring students' ability to retain information or engage with information? Is historical thinking the guide, or is historical knowledge the guide for my lessons? And so these are questions that I think about like every lesson that we're doing. A lot of times we want to do better and we'll say, how do I incorporate historical thinking into my class? And I think a better question is, what's the content I can highlight to nurture historical thinking? And so for us in our planning and when things get overwhelming, October is coming. It's a hard month. If we just ask, how do I incorporate this thinking? It becomes an added burden that we can leave out. But if content becomes the thing we need to add into historical thinking, it's integrated, it's our foundation, and it becomes easier to do even amidst the chaos and hardships that we experience in the classroom. And so I'll skip ahead because I tend to be long-winded, but some considerations that I hope that you all can think through. How am I managing the classroom with this inquiry mindset? Is the inquiry that I'm expecting of students, is it written? I learned early on that if I told my students something, I had minimal adoption. If I wrote it, they took it as gospel. How am I doing intellectual prep with historical thinking? You know, thinking through these processes. What routines do I have? What number of lessons a week have these routines of historical thinking? What types of questions am I giving my students the opportunity to answer? What kind of protocols do I have? And then scaffold, right? Again, I said it earlier, these cognitive apprenticeships. Historical thinking is hard and is unnatural. Don't be afraid in the first few months to do the intellectual lift. You're the expert. You've been trained here. Your students, this is all new to them. Model for them. Let them become your apprentices in historical analysis. Don't be a constructivist on the first day of school and then be frustrated that students can't think historically. Excerpt things. I'll save this debate for maybe a drink on another occasion, but excerpt over modification is really helpful for cultivating historical empathy. The past wasn't written for you, student, and that's why they wrote in a weird language that you're not used to, and that's okay. And then just living by this practice makes permanent. If historical thinking isn't something that you add, it won't be successful. If it's embedded into the framework of your class, it can make permanent. And then finally, make it communal. There's students that are leaders, and you can lean on them as coaches, but the more you can make community or thinking in community the core part of your class, students' incentive to outsource to a friend or to not doing anything or to AI just drops because a community of practice and community of thinking becomes the goal. And this culture of error thing, it says among students, but I would even say it's most important for us. When we're modeling, when we acknowledge our own mistakes in real time, that really cultivates those thinking practices. So I truly do always went a little bit over time. I'm going to pause for a second and just kind of remind us to think through, this is the aim. We want to empower students to think deeply about what we're engaging with. The question is how do we create a path of least resistance that becomes the flow of our classrooms? And I hope that the considerations and some of the comments here help for that. I'm especially excited for Donna to take over and talk through how we can make that explicit with constitutional moments. So thank you guys, and I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for everyone who interacted in the chat, and I encourage you to continue to do that. You can elevate questions. The one question we had was, will you all get a copy of the slides? Yes, 1000% you will. And I always just really appreciate listening to Zach and Thinking Nation's approach to historical thinking. And I can't do two things at once, so I'm going to share my screen and then finish that thought and then jump back in. And share and slideshow. And so when Zach invited me to be part of this back to school webinar, I thought about a through line to how we think about civic learning, civic literacy, and the dispositional aspects of what it means for the teacher. I couldn't agree more that, you know, it's not easy. Historical thinking is an unnatural act, even for historians, they have to learn it. But and certainly for teachers, and then trying to get our students to do it. So I always take the approach that it starts with the disposition of the teacher. And so picking up the charge that Zach and Thinking Nation really make is we need to make explicit what's implicit. Take the implicit, make it explicit. And so that's what we're going to talk about now with constitutional moments. And so I'm not able to see the chat as well from a presenter point of view, but I am going to be asking you to interact with the chat, and perhaps at times, because we're a small enough group, maybe come off mute, and certainly near the end as well. So if you had a chance to scan this QR code, if you're not already a part of our mailing list, please do so. I'll put it up at the end as well. We're not spammy. We give you lots of really cool things and invitations and free resources and opportunities. So diving right in, in talking to other audiences, sometimes I spend some time talking about civic engagement, and I'm going to jump and assume, we know what happens when people assume, but I'm still going to assume that we all believe that at the core of what we do and why we do it as social studies teachers, as civic educators, as history teachers, we not just public education, but education and democracy serves the ends to perpetuate that democracy, and that we all want to see students be engaged, informed, and empathetic citizens. Now, they don't all have to march. This is just one example. But how do we get from the classroom to what we want to see happening outside the classroom because of our students' experiences in our classroom? So we're going to start with anarchy. Not this anarchy. So I have a little story to tell. This is as the memes have it, like, this is how I became radicalized as a this is the moment I became radicalized as a civic educator. So I was in ninth grade, learning in my national state NSL government class in Maryland. And my teacher, Miss Schultz, who I just idolized, I thought she was brilliant, and just really dynamic, was teaching us about anarchy. She wrote the definition of it on the board. And this is not what the classroom was like, but and then she went to move on. And so we were looking at like different forms of government. Of course, anarchy is the absence of government. And I was like, she's like, but and then she went to move on. And I raised my hand. I said, wait a minute, anarchy sounds kind of cool and interesting, like no rules, no laws, anyone can do whatever they want. Like what's wrong with that? Like, she was kind of throwing it up there as like an option, and so I wanted to know more about that. Why, like, what's so bad about anarchy? She pauses. She comes over to my desk. Mind you, I'm in ninth grade. She takes my purse and brings it back to her desk and proceeds to dump it upside down on her desk. I am a ninth grade girl. She is dumping my purse out on her desk. And I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing? And then she's looking through, movie was on last week. I love it. She's dumping out her own purse. But imagine someone dumping out a student's purse on their desk. And she starts going through it. And she's like, oh, look at your lipstick. That's a good color. I'm going to take it. And and she's put something in her desk. She's counting my money. And I was like, what are you doing? That's not fair. You can't do that. And at that, that's not me, but that's someone who's upset. At that, she paused and she did something that completely changed the way I think. At that time, I was not going to be a social studies teacher or be a civic educator or do any of the things I'm doing today. But when I think about how I think about what it means to be a civic educator, I go back to this moment over and over again. She recognized and sees this constitutional moment. So we always talk about, like, capturing a teachable moment, but what I'm framing for everyone is that these are constitutional moments. I could argue that every teachable moment is a constitutional moment, but there are some that are very much on the nose, and this was one of them. She targeted my sense of injustice. I'm like, that's not fair. You can't do that. She did something extra too. She gave us a lived experience. I mean, I had a visceral reaction. I was upset. I was embarrassed. Students around me were like, oh my God, this is horrible. What's happening? Also, they're laughing, not knowing what's going to happen next. She came out of that, obviously, gave me my stuff back and said, well, if this were anarchy, you wouldn't have those rights. There is no property, there is no privacy, there is no security. She made her point. And she took it a step further, so, we went into the rest of the lesson. We had a contrasting point of view about anarchy compared to other forms of government. And I remember after that, I was like, I'm never letting that happen again. And some of my fellow classmates and I wrote this little baby constitution to make sure our rights would never be tread on. Now, albeit very limited in the scope of that classroom and ninth graders, and for the purpose of that lesson. But I'll never forget it. And so here's what I want us to talk about. which is how are we as teachers seizing onto those constitutional moments? So I have lots of questions to get at that. So go ahead and use the chat. Has this ever happened to you as a teacher or a student? I'm sure it has, right? Like you see some kind of teachable moment. So go ahead and put some things in the chat. Yeah, Fourth Amendment for the win. And I didn't know what the Fourth Amendment was then, right? Like we hadn't learned that yet, but I knew there was something wrong. I didn't have the vocabulary yet to say, you have violated my search and seizure rights, I didn't have, case law to cite, but I knew there was something inherently unfair and wrong and unconstitutional with what she was doing. Go ahead and put some of your own examples in the chat. And while you do that, I'll go deeper with what the role of the teacher is. We are all civic educators, no matter no matter what you're teaching, but especially in social studies, but really anyone in the school building is a civic educator. Again, I don't think I have to sell that proposition. Zach's earlier reference to the fact that, schools might say 8% of schools might say they focus on civics, but they don't necessarily prioritize it. And when you think about how we have literacy across the curriculum, we are all teachers of reading, we are all teachers of writing. We don't let kids do bad math, even though we're not the math teacher. We have a missed opportunity with civic literacy and civic dispositions. It's just not something that has ever been attended to as a discipline the same way literacy and even STEM competencies and numeracy. But students all the time, all day in and out of the classroom, form their civic dispositions either incidentally or intentionally. All kinds of classrooms experiences, not just in social studies, form these. And we have the power, especially as civic educators, but I would argue any teacher has this power, to help them form civic dispositions intentionally. And I want you to think about this at a time when certain things are being called into question about what is rule of law and what are different levels of power and what is equal opportunity. Then it's even more important that in the classroom and in relation to their fellow students and with you and with all the authority dynamics within a school, that we reinforce the constitutionalism that is part of our government structure, but can exist within the school. Uh, so students all the time recognize what's unfair. So we're going to play with that for a couple minutes. And the thing is, students are born with justice in their hearts. They have an inherent understanding and belief about what's fair and what's not. If you have your own kids at home, you hear it all the time. And I would pay money to well, I won't. I don't have that money. But I bet there's not a single teacher here on this call who hasn't had a student say to them, that's not fair, for something that's happened. If not in your classroom, then, outside the classroom or in their own lives or, in their community. And so we can capture that. Again, that's just one example, but it's a prime example. It's just all the time kids are talking about what's not fair. And that's where we can seize that constitutional moment. Oh yeah, see? Oh my God, these are already flowing. Well, I could just turn this over to some of you all to continue it, but I'll provide a little more uh voiceover to it, and then we'll keep sharing. So, students' sense of constitutionality is formed by who they are influenced by and the groups they belong to. So that's everything from sports teams. Think about how they elect captains, or sometimes they're chosen by the coach. My daughter was just elected captain of her field hockey team, but a third captain was chosen by the coach. Think about what that tells her about authority, majority rule, power, privilege. I mean, it's really interesting. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but she's forming a sense of hierarchy, authority, and responsibility, just by going through that. All kinds of communities, they learn about social contracts in these groups that they're in, whether they're formal or informal. And those also then lend themselves to rules, responsibilities, and privileges. So they are already getting these experiences. We can't stop that from happening. This, is happening at home in their families. So these are already happening. Sometimes they spill into the classroom, but sometimes things that happen directly in the classroom are those things we can seize upon. So when a student says it's not fair that everyone has to stay in at recess because one or two students were acting up, what they're really saying is this violates my Eighth Amendment right to due process. Punishments should fit the crime, or we should not be guilty by association. You know, fifth graders aren't going to have that vocabulary or that understanding, but that's what they're saying when they say that's not fair. When they say, oops, I don't need to write on that. Why am I writing? Go away. When they say it's not fair when a field trip is canceled, and like, no one can do anything about it, what they're really saying is we should have had a voice in that. We were not represented in those decisions. Why don't we get a say? Why doesn't our opinion and our vote matter in that regard? When they say it's not fair, when they see or hear something in the news about a group of people not being treated fairly, they're saying that's not fair. What they're saying is different people should not have different rights. We are all equal. We should have equal protection of the law or equal opportunity. This violates our social contract. So they might come in with, having seen a headline or having, learned something in history. And this is what they mean when they say that's not fair. So how many times have we heard them say that? Do we capitalize on that to really bring it down to what the constitutional moment can do for students and forming their civic dispositions? So you have all kinds of examples coming into the chat here. Think of other constitutional messages students are conveying with that's not fair. Or, where's the end quote? Don't have that. Or what are some other things they say that also have constitutional import? Um, that's not fair. It's just a very popular and pervasive one. So what should we do in these moments? So you can tell I had some fun. So I have like 3 steps. They don't form any kind of like nice thing, but first you want to just be open to it. When they say that's not fair, I mean, I'm guilty of being like, yeah, I know it's not fair, but we got to get on with the next thing. But really, as civic educators, we have to be agents of civic education and civic literacy. And so when we pause and recognize and validate their constitutional a disposition, and pause in that moment, then that gives them that gives you that pause and that break to allow that next piece to take place. You want to then fortify, and you do that by unpacking what they've said, anchor it back to what you're learning or what you're teaching, what they're learning, help it generate more questions. You may not be able to address it all right there, but make a space for it and forecast when you're going to go into it deeper, or just, yes, let's unpack that now. Or think about the next time you're going to come back and address the same type of injustice or the same type of question. And then, the thing I like to spend a lot of time on and other times is the irony of our education is that students are learning about democracy in a completely authoritarian setting. So helping students identify where the power is in the situation that they find unfair or that they want to be able to do something about, um, helps them navigate that and acknowledging that yes, we are in an authoritarian setting. You can't get rid of that teacher down the hall. But where do you have power to make a difference or to have your voice heard or to tell the principal you don't agree with the decision and maybe next time here's a new process? So think about a potential or past opportunity to seize, fortify, and empower your students by capturing constitutional moments. All right, and just think about how will you recognize those opportunities? So again, that's not fair is a big clue, but they're going to bring up other things. They might just ask you a question. Encourage them to express their views, question the status quo. We want students coming out of our classrooms and out of our schools understanding what their role is in a democracy and having that civic disposition to have that lived experience of what rule of law is. You know, how you mediate when someone says someone stole their pencil or stole their phone, that teaches them about justice, that teaches them about property, that teaches them about due process. How will you fortify? So, and that's why I'm going to give you a bunch of ideas and things to add to your already very full arsenal. So how do you continue to build their schema of democratic principles through their lived experiential connections? So this is like in and around, above and beyond, throughout the teaching and the lessons that you're already planning, right? Like these are seizing those moments and weaving them into the things you're already doing. So how do you help them, you know, how do you deepen their understanding of rule of law through these interactions? So they might be incidental when they happen, but you are intentional in capturing them, validating them, fortifying them. Can you, you know, do you use the term social contract when someone does something that violates the norms you've established in your classroom? How do you talk about these? How do you deepen the students, not just understanding, but experience of these constitutional principles through all of these opportunities? And then how will you empower them? Recognize who the key decision makers are. Aren't they cute? They are so cute. Emphasize the importance of working within the system. This isn't to say like, oh, anytime they're upset, let's go march. I mean, you know, and taking action isn't always the answer. But it's about knowing where the power lies in a given situation or decision, so that students understand just how to situate what it is that they're bringing to the surface. So what are some parts of this that you're already doing? What are some new actions you might take? And actually, let me see. We'll come back to that because I think it'll be good to bring together the two parts of our talk tonight and allow you some time to kind of synthesize the two and just kind of bring together questions and ways you're thinking about your own classroom practices in historical thinking, making the implicit explicit. So a couple more notes to get from this to this. This is a young lady speaking at a town hall. We need this and this and this and this. Okay, that's just a fun little collage. At the Center for Civic Education, we have our two flagship programs that fortify civic dispositions. I'd love to tell you a lot more about them if you don't already know. Some of you on this call are We the People and Project Citizen teachers and mentors. And if you're not, then definitely sign up for our newsletter or shoot me an email and we'll bring you into the fold. But right on our website, we have a lot of free resources that can help you in these constitutional moments, in addition to what's already in your arsenal. So we have our 60-second civics podcast. That's a quick 30-second, put in the chat if you use 60-second civics. We have over 4,000 episodes. You can, oh, I went the wrong order. Okay, I'm going to start with civil dialogue. We have our civil dialogue toolkit. This is the wrong order of my little slides here. The civil dialogue toolkit, once you're at a point where you want to like go deep into a conversation using text-based approach, the Paideia seminar or the structured academic controversy, all free, downloadable, customizable, plus videos with how to use it. Oh, see, guys, I need to come out of this. All right, let's just do this. But I'll do this better. I made it. It went in the wrong order, and the things are in the wrong order. This is a very forgiving group. Okay, civics inquiries. So going back to that inquiry, and so we have a foundations of democracy set, and then all of the topics here. Yeah, 60-second civics are great. So these are for, when you have a couple days and want to go deep. So maybe it's not fair that the voting age is too high. That's what's not fair. We have a lesson for that. It seems like not everyone is included in some of the new orders coming down. That's not fair. Well, let's examine who are we the people? What does that mean? So we have a lot of those that are at your disposal. And you can do them in part or in whole. Sometimes you just want a great quotation to get some conversation started. We have over 300 quotations. They're in alphabetical order by person. You can search them. Those are really fun. Constitution Explained. These are 5 to 6 minute videos. There are 30 of them. So when you're ready for that, or if you have 5 or 6 minutes because the students have raised something in that moment and you want to talk about, give them some explainer. And then, of course, these are the 60-second civics videos, podcasts, and those are a great quick hit, and you can think about, they ask the question or they want to know, why something is the way it is. You can pull any number of these. You can make your own playlist. There's all kinds of ways to sort those and weave those in and help them fortify your students' civic dispositions when the time is right. Oh, thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, so now these are building in the wrong direction. See, okay, here we go. So now,
Donna,
I'm,
I'll quickly say it's 4:01. So we'll wrap up. I know some of you have to go, but yeah, I also don't want to make people leave before you know what you want to say.
yeah, no, this is the last slide. If you want to in the chat or to come off mute as we wrap up to share any of your ahas or questions or ways you're thinking about your back to school dispositions. And thank you everyone for sticking with us. Again, sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so already. And yeah, 701 for East Coast and then 601 for Central. I will unshare. And thanks everyone for joining. We will send the recording and the slides. Again, you're welcome to come off mute or put your camera on to chat. It's officially over.